Thanks for joining us for a special bonus episode of Beyond the Pulpit from Woodlands Church. Before we launched the podcast in December, Shane and I recorded a few early conversations as we prepared to preach through 2 Corinthians. These audio-only podcasts were designed to help our church, you, think more deeply about our current sermon series in 2 Corinthians. Some of the information will be things that you have learned in our sermons, but much of it will be new and help you gain a bird's eye view of the letter. Thanks for listening.
Welcome to the Woodlands Church podcast, where we dive deeper into God's Word and explore the big story of Scripture. We're starting a new series on the book of 2 Corinthians, the same book we're preaching through on Sundays. Whether you're new to the Bible or you've been following Jesus for years, our hope is that this podcast gives you the tools, context, and confidence to engage with God's Word more deeply. I'm Shane, and I'm here with Matt, one of our pastors at Woodlands. In today's episode, we're laying the groundwork for the rest of this series. We'll talk about who wrote 2 Corinthians, what was happening in the church at the time, and why the letter still matters today. So let's jump in. Matt, let's start with the basics. Who wrote 2 Corinthians?
So, Paul is the undisputed author. Nobody disagrees with that idea. Both it says his name in it, like Paul, I send you this letter, and it's also the tradition of the early church as well. So nobody is really questioning that it's true to the Apostle Paul. It also mentions in chapter 1, verse 1, that Timothy was also one of the senders. For sure, he's a co-sender. We wouldn't say he was a co-writer, you might say. Probably more of a scribe. But the voice is clearly Paul. I think what it does indicate too is that Paul wasn't a lone wolf. He worked in teams. And so Timothy was one of his ministry partners in all this. This letter is really cool too, because it's probably one of his most personal and emotional letters that we ultimately get from Paul in all of his writings.
Interesting. So what's the timeline here? When was this written, and what was going on that made Paul write it?
So it was likely written in the year either 55 or 56 AD, or maybe over that time span too. It was during Paul's third missionary trip, and we think he wrote it from Macedonia based on the evidence in the book. Now, do you know where Macedonia is?
I don't. Can you please educate me on where Macedonia is?
Absolutely. So if you know where Greece is, so think of the Mediterranean here. You have Italy, the boot-shaped country, right? Uh-huh. You go east, you have another country that jets out into the middle of the Mediterranean. That's Greece. All right. You go on the east side up through Greece, where, people go on like Greek cruises and stuff like that to all the Greek Isles. And at the north part of that, where it turns east, that's the area that in the Roman world was called Macedonia. Now, today, part of that would be modern Greece. Some of it would be a country that is actually called North Macedonia.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah, I know, exactly. Amazing that they match, right?
Yeah.
And then part of it would be what we would consider Bulgaria today as well. So these are real places. I just want to point that out. This is not like make-believe stuff here. These are real places in the real world.
Not something that was written in a storybook that doesn't exist.
That's right.
It is a place that is still here today.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so now here's the cool thing about this, though, is this is actually Paul's fourth letter to the Corinthians.
Interesting. So in the Bible, in the New Testament, I've only ever noticed 2 letters. So where did the other 2 letters go?
It's such a good question. What we probably have in our Bibles is what would be the second letter, and this one would be the fourth letter to the Corinthians. And there's 2 other ones that we don't have, actually. We know this because in 1 Corinthians 5, he references a previous letter, a previous time that he wrote the Corinthians. And then in the second letter, he also references another letter that was sent before he wrote this letter. And we don't have them. They weren't preserved. Part of the idea, I think, with any of his letters was that they were sent to a church and then they were circulated amongst at least the regional churches, if not even wider than that. For example, even at the beginning of 1 Corinthians, it says to the church in Corinth and all the churches in Achaia, which is the whole region that is around Corinth right there. And so 2 were preserved, 2 were not preserved. 2 are scripture and inspired by the Spirit of God, and 2 were not.
Interesting. So if Paul wrote the letters, why do you think that it wasn't inspired by God with those last two letters?
You know, I think that's an interesting thing. So when we talk about the inspiration of Scripture, Paul is still a man, and God superintends the writing of say, 2 Corinthians or Ephesians or Matthew or something like that. Whoever the author would be, he does it through the human agent, through the person. And you know what? At the same time, though, Paul was still a dude.
Interesting. So it's almost like the status of who Paul was doesn't necessarily matter in the grand scheme of God if it doesn't fit within his will. Is that correct?
I think there's some degree to that, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, you know, Paul is still a man, and who can err? And yet there's a degree to which his unique apostolic authority did lend itself to this was how God chose to inscripturate his writing for all times, really.
Wow, that's really interesting. So let's back up a bit. What was going on in the Corinthian church that made it such a mess?
Okay, so the Corinthians, they were a lot like us in that they lived pursuing the excesses of life, all right? Yeah, that's our world today. We live in this time where we got to do things and we got to do it all the way. You know, if I'm going to lift my truck, well, I'm going to go all the way and make this like the true 909 truck, okay? But here, I would say there's 5 things that the Corinthians really dealt with that were in excess. So one was money. There's power, believe it or not, athleticism.
Wow.
Speech, and then sensuality. And I would love to actually talk a little bit about all those, okay? But do those sound like all things that we can relate to in our world?
I was just going to say, it almost sounds like you're talking about our modern day America.
Yes, it totally does, doesn't it? I mean, surely money, right?
Absolutely.
We are constantly living to some degree for the pursuit of money. You know, we work jobs so we can live and buy a house and then buy a better house and then make sure we're paying our car payments and all those things. And, you know, Corinth was a rich city. So a little bit on the history of it, it stretches back a long, long time before the first century, like when Jesus was living, at least 400 plus years. And then eventually it was destroyed. But even in its ancient days, it was known as being a rich city. It was reestablished by actually Julius Caesar, the emperor of Rome, in the year 40 something BC. So before Christ's birth, it was reestablished, and it was a really important city. Julius Caesar saw it not just as like, hey, this is a cool place to build. No, he saw it as a strategic place as well. So where it's located, it has ports, one on the Aegean, one on the Ionian Sea. Okay. And so what a ship would do if it was moving from east to west or vice versa, west to east, is it would actually come to one of those ports, even either the port in Corinth or on the other side of what we call the isthmus, which is just a little narrow strip of land. It's actually about 5 miles long, if even that. And the other city was called Cenchreae, which also is mentioned in the Bible. When you read the book of Acts, for example, Paul leaves from that port. What people would do, though, is they would pull their ship into one of the ports, unload their cargo. It would get transported the 5 or so miles across the isthmus, loaded onto another ship, and then taken into the Ionian Sea, like towards Italy. Ultimately, this could save up to like a week's worth of sailing time, and it would get their cargo there faster. Okay. Kind of like the Panama Canal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, even the Romans, they wanted to build a canal so they could sail a ship through that. Okay. There were plans to do it. There was even attempts to do it. They never saw it through until, I don't know, over 1,000 years later. Because if you go to Corinth today, there actually is a canal, and you can sail through it.
Interesting.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
But because of this like unique feature, it made the city just so wealthy.
I was going to say, with it being a port city, it would make sense for it to draw most of the wealth in the region.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It drew so much wealth because you think about how that business model would work. They bring their goods in to transport it over. Well, they probably pay a fee. And where does it go? It's like basically like a tax, right? Think about it here in Southern California. A ship comes into the port of Los Angeles and they unload their cargo, but they have to pay in order to do that, to use the port services. And of course, how do they make that? Well, they they've put the cost onto the consumer so that it's not huge on the consumer and not huge on the company, but in the end, it makes that city pretty wealthy.
Wow.
So, now, similarly here, so money was one of those excesses that they were trapped in. Another one was power. Okay. And similarly to our country, usually those two go in hand, right?
Right.
Money and power. And, since Corinth was wealthy, the pursuit of power and status followed. And in these ways, Corinth was not that much unlike our own world. If they had existed, the ports around Corinth would have been filled with super yachts.
Super yachts. Interesting.
That's right. Super yachts of the rich businessmen, like, the Jeff Bezos of the Roman Empire. I don't know who that was, by the way. Do you?
I don't.
I don't know. I wonder who the equivalent would be. Because I bet there was somebody, right?
You would think.
I know.
They had to be around somewhere. They were probably out floating on a chair in the masses.
Probably. Yes. Or who else goes on super yachts? Athletes, right?
Oh, that's correct.
Like you like if you ever read the tabloids, which I don't, do you?
No.
No, good. Yeah, that's good. I didn't think you did, but who do you see?
Would you have judged me if I did?
Maybe a little.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah, maybe a little, but you see athletes on them, right?
Right.
And so that's another one of the excesses of Corinth. Okay, is the pursuit of athleticism.
Interesting.
Okay? Now we've all heard of the Olympics.
Correct.
We still have it, right? And we have the modern Olympic Games. Some years ago, it was restarted as a worldwide thing for peace and whatever. But that was part of the ancient world. But here's the thing about Corinth: they had what they called the Isthmian Games. So Isthmian meaning like where the isthmus is, that little section of land between the two sides of Greece there. And it was actually a huge thing. Instead of every 4 years, it took place every 2 years. It was a huge draw. Of course, like anything, it would bring in tourists.
Right.
Like the modern Olympics, even for that matter, right?
And also not allow the athletes to take a break. They were literally every 2 years, you're back on the game running, huh?
Exactly. Yeah. It's so true. And, so it was a big part of it, but unlike the modern Olympics, it was in the same place every time. You see, and so it was always in Corinth. In fact, they were so enamored with these games, they would parade the winners through the streets. Okay, I have to say it, naked.
Oh,
it's a different time, right?
Sounds like Corinth.
Yeah, exactly, right? Also the Olympians would in Athens, they would receive a wreath made from a laurel, from like a laurel tree. We still use the bay laurel leaves. That's what they made it from. They would put it around their head and everything. But here's the thing: guess what they would make the wreath out of for the Isthmian Games?
What?
Celery.
Interesting. Why is that?
I have really no idea. It's just one of those random facts that it's like, I learned it at some point, so I got to share that one.
Do you think they had ranch available with the celery?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, how can you have ranch, or how can you have celery without ranch?
All throughout time, ranch has been necessary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, here's the thing though. I dare somebody to someday, when Daniel's preaching on 2 Corinthians, to come in with a head wreath made of celery.
In the middle of his sermon, just put it on his head.
Totally, right?
Crown him. Inaugurate him.
Yes, I would love that. I would love that, honestly. Yeah, but here's the thing, it was one of those draws for the Corinthians, and Paul used that as a metaphor. In fact, even in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he says, "Do you not know that all the runners in a stadium compete, but only one receives the prize? So run to win. Each competitor must exercise self-control in everything. They do it to receive a perishable crown, but we an imperishable one."
Wow. So Paul actually took everything that was going on during that time and found a way to correlate it to Jesus and his kingdom.
So true, right? I mean, if you think about it, Paul was in Corinth on his second missionary journey for about 18 months. Okay. Now, if it happens every 2 years, there's a good chance he was there during the games.
So he saw the masses.
He could have, yeah.
And he saw the people running naked.
Something like that, yeah. I wonder if that wasn't as uncommon of a sight as we might think it would be.
Probably.
And I'm thankful that's an uncommon sight for us nowadays.
Yes.
Another big excess that really somehow landed in Corinth was the propensity for speech. At this time in the ancient Greek world, there was a revival in the importance of public speaking skills, kind of going back to the time of like Plato and Aristotle. But
philosophers.
Well, yes, and you have to remember philosophers were usually also poets.
Interesting.
And so there was an entertainment value to this as well, or even like the ancient Greek plays. And so that was a huge piece of the public speaking realm that we're talking about here.
So it sounds like the philosophers during that time might have possibly had many hats. They were sharing poetic writings and speeches with each other. And on top of that, would they have been seen almost as like a scientific figure, like in their search for science, or what we would call modern day science?
I think there's an element to that. Yeah, I really do. They were viewed as the purveyors of truth in a way.
Interesting.
Even in our modern world, we do have some equivalents with like famous pastors, who, don't have like little podcasts, but have like major television ministries and things like that. And people flock to them,
Right.
And it usually has to do with, well, they're good speakers.
So these philosophers would brush their hands and people would start to fall over?
Well, I'm not sure about that. I don't think they went to that extreme there. Or maybe another equivalent would be like maybe more of a secular version would be how we use social media, or in particularly like X, formerly Twitter, because there's just like any like politician, for example, who wants a platform is going to be on X. And like they're going to tweet all the time, and their comments are going to be the most pithy, or the most poignant, or the most well heard, or something like that, and so that would be a good equivalent to this. And so and there's accounts of like people going to the Temple of Poseidon, which is in Corinth, or was in Corinth, and just getting up on the steps and philosophizing or reciting their poetry, and people would applaud or ignore them if it wasn't good. It was a real thing though that created this culture of excess in the city of Corinth.
So you brought up Poseidon. Were these philosophers atheists, or did a lot of them possibly believe in other gods?
They believed in the pantheon of gods of the ancient world.
So they were polytheistic.
Yeah. I think the word is pantheistic.
Pantheistic, okay.
And so like pantheism is that there are multiple gods, but there is kind of a hierarchy among the gods.
Interesting.
Polytheism has a little different connotation where there's multiple gods. Usually it is of even more ancient cultures where there's gods of different regions. And so, you have to, as you enter into a region, for example, you would have to appease that god who resides in that area. But as the ancient Greeks, the Romans too saw it, because the Romans adopted a lot of the Greek pantheism of gods here, is that there was ultimately one authoritative god. That was Zeus, and then like Poseidon, he was the god of the sea. And that was one of the temples actually that was in Corinth. Well, why? Well, sea travel is dangerous. I mean, you read Acts, Paul was shipwrecked, right? Mm-hmm. I think he was even shipwrecked one other time too, that we didn't hear about in Acts, but he mentions it actually in 2 Corinthians. So it wasn't an uncommon thing. And so what would people do? Well, the sailors especially, they would get off their boats and go and, quote unquote, worship at the temple of the sea god, So,
I see a lot of similarities with this also in the Old Testament with Jonah, in the sense of the sailors praying towards their gods in regard to the storm that was happening. And even also with Moses, when Moses approached Pharaoh and brought the plagues, it was almost as if he was targeting each specific god during that time.
Yeah, I've heard that too, actually. And so there's always this battle between, the one God of the Bible, the one God who is the creator of all things, with these cultures that had gods for various things. And so yeah, I think you're totally right with the plagues. It was a direct confrontation with the false gods of Egypt.
Exactly.
I think I've heard the same of the creation narrative in Genesis 1 as well.
Interesting.
And so, because various ancient Near East creation narratives would have different pieces of the story, and what the Bible was doing was saying, no, there is one God who does this all, and so it was it was telling that creation story, that is true. It's not. I say story. I don't mean that this is like a mythological, unicorn or something like that.
Right.
It's we're talking about something that is very, very real in what it's describing, but at the same time, there's kind of the polemical element of it. The level that it reorients people away from something that is false. And so you're going to say, okay, I get it. I no longer believe in this God. No, God, Yahweh, is the God of all. And so, yeah, there's a piece in that of course Paul did have to really address.
It's awesome to see how much our God has prevailed throughout history,
Absolutely.
Especially within the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely. So now there's one more big excess that the Corinthians really dealt with. And that was kind of their sensuality, Now, okay, in our world, the clear and obvious connection would be Las Vegas, right?
Okay, so Corinth was, in our time, a modern-day Las Vegas.
In some ways, yeah. Las Vegas has that reputation, right, for being just a sexually immoral place in the world. And even so much that they kind of advertise it,
Yeah, people are walking on the streets naked, kind of similar to the athletes.
Well, yeah, it's true. That kind of happens in LA too, but for very different reasons.
Yeah.
And so, and so Corinth was kind of the Vegas of the ancient world. And so now much of the reputation that Corinth had came about actually 100 years, or actually 400 years before Christ. For example, it was said that another temple in the city, the temple to the goddess of love, or Aphrodite, it had at one time 1,000 cult prostitutes available.
Wow, that is a lot.
Right. And so scholars, as we do the research, they're like, I think that might be an exaggeration here, but nonetheless, it was a lot, right? And so, but to be clear, what it does represent in reality is that Corinth was in a class of its own in this regard. Now, remember, this is over 400 years before Christ. All right. In fact, part of the reason we know this is that this ancient Greek playwright, his name was Aristophanes, coined the term to Corinthianize.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, to Corinthianize. He took the city's name and he made it a verb. It meant to fornicate. That's what it meant.
Wow.
But like I said, that was about 400 BC, and this letter was written about 450 years later. And so many scholars suggest that by the time the first century city was around, when this letter was being written, the city was not quite as sensually charged as it once was. But here's the thing. There's no doubt that sensuality was still one of those excesses that was prevalent even in Paul's time. So now, clearly, there's a tie between our modern world with the prevalence of pornography and the sexualization of even just we find in common media and television and things like that.
And it's so easy to access in our modern time. It's crazy.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. So, there's a few other things I should probably mention in this too, so as an example, as a church, the Corinthians struggled with these things. And here's the thing, Paul definitely deals with them directly at times. We see this especially in the first letter. We see this, he deals directly with sexual sin, for example, with idol worship, for example, the other things too, a little bit even like I was mentioning with the drive for athleticism. And then in the second letter, we actually hear some of him dealing with the propensity to desire the eloquent speeches and things of the world at the time. But Paul also, he really gets down to the nitty gritty of it, where he gets to the roots of these things, the roots that lead to sexual sins and things like that, like pride. And then another thing he addresses like constantly throughout both of the letters is the spiritual immaturity that was in the church.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. What I find to be really interesting is how long Corinth was around before the time of Jesus. It almost makes sense that this culture is hardwired into the people of the community. And it's taking Paul a lot of work to unwire what the culture has created during that time.
I would totally agree. Yeah. I mean, we see this even in like modern mission settings where the gospel starts to take root in very, well, we would, I think what we as Westerners would think of as very unchristian cultures. And there's a lot of things that have to be addressed with it. And here's the other thing though, a lot of this has even happened. We see it happening in places like Europe, where we typically thought that was like a Christian place, where the gospel takes root in people's lives, but they have to relearn how to stop living as like a secular person. And you know what? I think we're so close to that in our country too, where
Absolutely.
we have to stop living as secular people, and that's been so ingrained in us, and so anyways, we could probably have a whole podcast just on that one. I'll stop talking on that one right now.
Episode 2, guys.
Oh boy. Yes. And now here's the other another thing about this letter. There was a lot of, there rose up in between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, in those years in between, some opposition to Paul. And I think for us, like we look at this and we're like, oh, this is like authoritative. And yet people didn't necessarily see Paul always in that light. And so there were others who came around and started preaching so-called gospel. It was a false gospel. And Paul actually has to address that with the Corinthian church. In fact, he kind of humorously starts to say that he starts to call these guys the super apostles. Now, Shane, I'm just so curious. What do you imagine when you hear the term super apostle?
I imagine that they're bulletproof and they can fly. Is that true?
Yes.
Oh,
no,
wow.
I'm just kidding. Yeah, totally. Right. We envision like a Marvel movie or something.
Exactly.
So